Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 83, The Exorcism Letters, a conversation with Joe Laycock and Dan Harms.
Welcome to D&D Outloud with Ben Riggs. I am Ben Riggs, apparently controversial historian and author of Slaying the Dragon, A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons. And over the past 13 years of writing and podcasting, I have met hundreds of creative geniuses in and around the world of tabletop role-playing games. Here on this show, I ask two of these flaming torches of the human imagination to come forth and have a fascinating discussion, which I then record and send out in the world. Tonight on D&D Out Loud, I'm joined by Joseph Laycock, who is going to go by Joe for the rest of this, a scholar of religion who loves exploring what happens when belief, culture, and controversy collide. Joe is an associate professor of religious studies at Texas State University, and he has written incredibly relevant works for anyone who remembers when D&D was treated like a portal to perdition, including Dangerous Games, his sharp look at the moral panic over role-playing games. He's also the editor of the Penguin Book of Exorcisms and the Penguin Book of Cults, because apparently he collects moral panics like some people collect dice. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. And also joining us tonight is Daniel Harms, and he'll just go by Dan for the rest of the show. Dan is a librarian, a researcher, and a cartographer of the weird. His work lives at the crossroads where folklore shakes hands with grimoires and the footnotes start whispering back. He's written and edited a stack of essential occult reference works, including the Necronomicon Files, a deep dive into the truth behind the legend. And he spent years tracking the history of magical texts, ritual traditions, and the kind of lore that feels 1 inch away from becoming an adventure hook for a role-playing game. He wrote the Encyclopedia Cthuliana, which is the indispensable source for Cthulhu mythos knowledge. If your idea of fun is primary sources, but make it eldritch, Dan is your man. So, Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, you before I hit record, mentioned how you met Joe. Can you tell us about how you two met?
So, we met at a conference in Halifax at King's College, which was on the topic of the devil. And so there was a good number of people who were kind of looking at the depictions of the devil as a sort of interdisciplinary study covering history and literature and all sorts of other details. And yeah, we came together there. And, this is not really this is kind of making Patricia Pulling look good, sort of, because obviously we have been corrupted in some way, but
so I guess I should say for audience members who are not Gen X, Patricia Pulling was one of the moral panickers of the 1980s. Gosh, it was her son's name was Bink. Again, Joe, this is your domain.
His name was Irving Pulling, but he went by Bink. Yeah.
And he took his own life, but she blamed D&D. Is my recollection?
That's right. She actually developed this scenario where he played D&D for about 5 hours in his entire life at his honors English program, but she said that the game had sort of programmed him like a Manchurian candidate to murder his family, and he couldn't overcome the psychic programming that D&D had done. So the only thing that he could do was to kill himself so that he wouldn't, carry out this sort of hypnotic command. So really, it wasn't a suicide at all. He literally martyred himself to protect his family from being murdered by Dungeons and Dragons. And you can understand why, as a parent, you might prefer to believe that version of events.
Man. Well, I guess this brings up one of the questions that I have sitting in front of me. and maybe you just answered it, but my question was going to be, why do some communities fear imaginary worlds so intensely, especially ones where you start incorporating spells, secret knowledge, demons, and things like that? What need does that fear fulfill?
Right. Well, I think that, conservative Christians have been afraid of demons and magic for a very long time. I mean, read St. Augustine, right? And if you pick up a first edition D&D book and you don't know what you're looking at, and you don't know what things like Thaco are, the only thing that you can really understand is there's a lot of scary pictures here, right? And some of those first edition covers had a big red Ifrit, demon-looking characters and things like that on them. But the other question is, why are they scared of the imagination? And I found this interesting there we go. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Keep that up there for a second.
Yeah. The cover of Dangerous Games is actually meant to be a parody of that cover that you just showed, right? Except it's holding a middle schooler instead of a buxom warrior babe in its clutches. But as a historian of religion, traditionally Christianity has looked to the imagination as something that is sacred, something that allows humans to know something about the nature of God. And so when I looked into the complaints about Dungeons and Dragons, they were saying, well, the imagination itself is evil, right? It's satanic, right? That fire trucks are red because that's what color God wants fire trucks to be. And if you imagine a blue fire truck, that's a satanic act, right? That's telling God the world is not enough. And I think that either consciously or unconsciously, what this is about is control, right? There is a realization that the ability to use your imagination to imagine worlds different from our own gives people a radical sort of autonomy. And if your goal is to basically replicate your version of the social order, then the imagination is a threat to you and it has to be stamped out. So I think some of the key people behind this moral panic understood that on some level and did not want young people to be exercising their imaginations.
Well, one of the things that jumps out as a similarity between the two of you is, again, Dan, you wrote the Necronomicon Files, which in the late 90s really was a hugely necessary demystification of rumor and myth that had accrued around the Cthulhu mythos. I went through at least a month of thinking the Necronomicon is real and there's a copy in my school library. Because I went and they had a Necronomicon all in Arabic, and I'm like, it's real, it's real. And there was a terrifying El Sprague de Camp introduction explaining, it was basically a little horror story explaining how dangerous this was, and you really shouldn't translate it, etc., etc. But your book went out of its way, I would say, to demystify it. And half of the book, as I recall, was the Necronomicon and culture, and the other half was the Necronomicon and magic. So I'm guessing that if I say the Necronomicon isn't real, that is is real, both of those are fraught idea. Would you agree with that, or are those both fraught things? Does the Necronomicon exist in tension?
You immediately have to get into the questions of what is real, and of course, what is the Necronomicon, because Lovecraft's idea of what the Necronomicon is sort of shifted over time. And what I think most of the hoax Necronomicons, the most common one you've probably seen is the Simon Necronomicon. It usually has a black cover. It's usually in paperback. It's usually at your local bookstore for some reason. So that's usually drawing from like the middle period of Lovecraft's fiction, like around 1928 or 29, where like it's the Dunwich horror and tales like that, where it's definitely going to be a book of spells. And a lot of people have taken all sorts of different directions in it. It would be so much more difficult to write that book today. And it was I've even had unintended consequences. Like Donald Tyson, the magician, wrote an introduction to our book, and then he was inspired by that to write his own Necronomicon. So I don't know if that was great. That doesn't seem to be what the result I was looking for, but he seems to have he published a few books on that, and he's got a few novels out there now. So he had a tarot deck. So he's probably actually making more money than the Necronomicon Files ever did.
Ben, can I tell a story about how I actually read Dan's book, the Necronomicon Files?
Please, I always feel like the more I can fade back in these conversations, the better. So please take over.
Mhm.
And Dan, I don't know if I told you this story, but I was approached by a public defender in a murder case, and it was an appeal. This person was arrested during a satanic panic in, I think, 1993, or at least that's when they were tried. And as it was explained to me by the defender, it went something like this: there was an unsolved murder in this town in Oregon. The police said, "I wonder if it was that weird goth kid." They went to the weird goth kid's house. They said, "Can we search your apartment?" And he said, "Sure." And they found a copy of the Simon Necronomicon. And for some dumb reason, the weird goth kid had like cut himself in the kitchen and thought, "I'm going to draw some symbols from this book on the wall with my blood." So the police saw that. They were looking for a murderer, and they said, "This is it. This is our guy." So he was arrested. And what was basically explained to the jury was the Necronomicon is a satanic book. Satanists murder people for no real reason. And therefore, if we have a murderer in our community, it was the owner of this book. And this was this person's last appeal. They've been on death row since 1993. And they said, "We need someone who can say that the Necronomicon is not a satanic book." And I said, "Well, yeah, I can say it's not a satanic book, but you know about H.P. Lovecraft, right?" And they said, "No, who is that? What are you talking about? Is that a lawyer?"
No.
And so no one, in deciding whether this person lived or died, had any idea who H.P. Lovecraft was or knew anything about the Necronomicon. And now, as I think about it, they probably got their idea that this was some, super dangerous book from people like Patricia Pulling, who wrote these manuals for police. That one of the questions, if you're basically busting a D&D ring, was ask if they've ever read the Necronomicon. So it was this deeply disturbing case, and I started to write. I wrote a book chapter about sort of how we got to this moment, and the Necronomicon Files was the only kind of really extensive scholarship that existed. So I'm really glad that you wrote that book, Dan.
That in and of itself is terrifying. That was that. I mean, could I ask if the appeal was successful?
I don't think that it was. I never heard back, and there may have been other evidence that was more convincing that I was not informed about. But the weirdest thing was I was supposed to fly out to testify, and I had packed my suit, and I was about to go to the airport, and I got a text that said, "Don't come to the airport." The judge, because of the appeal process, I was only able to use information that existed in 1993 when the trial occurred. So I was saying things like, "Well, in 1993, there was a movie called Army of Darkness that featured the Necronomicon, right? You should have known about that. You should have known this was not a serious book," and so forth. And then the judge ruled that because in 1993, I was in high school, that I could not take the witness stand and testify. So I never actually got to testify in this. If anyone had known the judge was going to rule that way, I would have found someone like J. Gordon Melton, who's a really kind of OG religious movement scholar who actually created a file on the Necronomicon at the University of Santa Barbara. But it was a very, very strange case.
Wow. Ben, it looks like you want to say something.
I've been furiously trying to find details of this case and miserably failing, because again, it's so. Talk about a nexus of horror, fascination, absorption, and tragedy all in one place, But I'm gonna have to do some digging on this after this call, because everything that is troubling and consuming about imagination and reality just seems to be all wrapped up in this case, where if you had one good nerd in that courtroom, maybe things would have gone differently for this person. And again, it's imagination being mistaken for reality, which is it's both of you seem, it's where I think your nexus is between the two of you. I could be wrong, but I think that's the commonality I really see between the two of you as academics.
Well, and maybe Dan can speak more about this, but I think there's a continuum between magic and art. And that was one thing that I tried to kind of suggest is, I know it's really spooky that this guy drew a symbol on the wall in his blood, but that could also be construed as art, right? There are artists who do things in blood, and I looked through the full list of books that they found questionable, and many of them were books on art and how to be an artist and how to do art. So I think that was one more thing that was misunderstood by law enforcement and the justice system in this case.
Yeah, I think there's quite an overlap between occultism and art, especially I'd say more recently. But even if you go back to the older books, you get these crazy complex diagrams that you stand in, or the demon's supposed to stand in, or you're just supposed to wear it. So, I think there was a lot of, someone at some stage was creative at putting all this together. I think it became more prominent more recently because of, printing techniques, and also because it's, people are we have more of an idea that art is about, self-expression, rather than art is copying down something that was supposedly by Solomon. But we kind of know it wasn't made by Solomon, but it sort of was. So, I think that there's definitely a nexus there it doesn't come up as often in my work because my work is a little bit older, but I have seen it. I mean, I think one of the major draws of the Necronomicon is the Simon Necronomicon is that seal on the cover. And that I talked to the artist on the book, and that was just basically something he came up with. That's not actually part of the Necronomicon magical system. He just put it up on the cover of the book. And then, people would just take it and they'd make pendants out of it, and then you get mad. And I think it turned up on like some wrestlers' costumes at one point. And it was just like, I don't know what to do with this. This is getting out of control. But yeah, so I think that a lot of it, I don't think the Simon Necronomicon would have gotten it as big as it did if it wasn't like the black book with the with the white with the white seal on it. They didn't, and as I pointed out to you in Halifax, they didn't go to yellow for like a year. They had a yellow Necronomicon. It was just the weirdest thing, and then they just gave up on that. Went back to black.
I'm really sorry to stick my nose in here, but I should say for the audience, Dan, can you tell us what the Simon Necronomicon is?
The Simon Necronomicon is a book which appeared in 1977, which is by Peter Levenda, most likely under the pseudonym Simon. Of course, Peter Levenda says he is not Simon, but I don't know. He's identified in Avon's Publishing's filings at the U.S. Copyright Office as Simon, which is a little bit problematic for him. Basically, my interpretation of this book is that it was an attempt to bring together magical traditions of the West that were primarily Christian with an atmosphere that was like very much looking at the pagan world. And what he tried to do is tried to create a Sumerian sort of grimoire that would be that people could use to bring together like the magic of the ancients with with their sensibilities about the rise of the goddess movements and things like that. And then I think someone at the bookstore where he was putting it together decided, well, we should put a Lovecraft spin on that. That'll be interesting. And and so it created this weird sort of hybrid monstrosity, which then became incredibly popular and has seen a lot of circulation in bookstores. If you go to the bookstore, you see like a book that says Necronomicon on the spine, and it's black, and it's a little black paperback. That's what it is. There are others out there. There are so many others out there, but that is usually the one that people talk about.
And didn't they make expensive leather-bound editions of the Simon Necronomicon?
They did. They started out with the expensive leather-bound editions, and I think they actually even did an anniversary volume. which was I think I've got that one. But yeah, so you could actually find some very, with great, leather bound, or I don't know if it's real leather. I'm not the person to ask, but
Human flesh.
It's got like gilt, it's silver gilt on the cover, and it looks very, very impressive. But so for people who are looking for something a little bit more upscale, but I think that there's nothing really like a Necronomicon that's paperback. You find it in some bargain bin someplace, and somebody's clearly been very excited about things. I have like a paperback one around here someplace. It's just like it's duct taped together, and it's just got notes in the margin of where I was trying to track down various parts of it, because a lot of it is from the books on Mesopotamia that were available in the 70s. So just like, okay, yeah, this passage comes from Pritchard. So that was a fun little activity. And then it became interesting because then Simon wrote a book in response, like 20 years later, called Dead Names, in which he basically, just excoriated myself and my co-author for just like, oh, you got all this stuff wrong. We got a couple things wrong. It's called writing a book, But it was just, and he told his own story, which was, of course, completely ridiculous. And, I think my take is completely made up. Well, the parts about the Necronomicon are made up. There's some interesting stuff in there, but yeah. So and now it's just kind of, both books are just kind of out there floating around, and people find them, and then they sometimes come argue with me about them.
So I saw one of the big leather ones when I went to see an exhibit of Ed and Lorraine Warren's Forbidden Objects collection at the Mohegan Sun Casino. And there were 5,000 people there, and they wanted to see Annabelle, the doll, and everything. And there was this big leather-bound book, but the sign in front of it said Necronomicon, because the people who put the exhibit together couldn't spell Necronomicon. And Necronomicon sounds like, something you would take for thinning hair.
Yeah, that's kind of like the first level of people who encounter the Necronomicon, the ones who can't spell it right.
There is this weird alliance, though, because the Simon Necronomicon was so exciting for people like the Warrens, right? Who could say,
yeah,
we have this evidence now that these kind of satanic conspiracy theories must be real because there's a book from Barnes and Noble, so it must all be true.
Yeah, I think I first encountered it we were going to academic team like question competitions in Kentucky, and we were on the bus, and one of my friends had it, and then someone took it away from him and started reading it out loud, and he snatched it out of their hands like, no, you can't do that. But it was, it was kind of that kind of made an impression on me. And so what happened is I actually wrote this book when I was an undergraduate, and don't write books when you're undergraduate. Not that I'm trying to discourage anybody. It's a lot of work.
You did great.
Yeah, thank you. But it was also, I just saw all the different aspects of it. And it was more of it was coming out because, this was about the time when the web had started. And so I was sitting there on the old Usenet groups and like trying to gather information and use interlibrary loan to pull things together. And I'm like, okay, well, okay, I can explain this now. And I don't think anyone else really has. So that, that was a great opportunity to do that. And I think it was probably about the right time. I'm just disappointed that nobody really picked up the torch from there and ran with it. I am sort of sad that the Necronomicon Files is still the best book on the topic. And it shouldn't be. Someone should have done something a lot better. Somebody who wasn't an undergraduate writing it should have picked it up and, done a much better job of it. But
what are the questions that you feel haven't been answered by your work?
I feel as if, let's see. I mean, of course, the whole idea of the Necronomicon has sort of exploded since then. It got to the point where, if you may remember that the first Hellboy movie, Guillermo del Toro put like quote from, it was slightly misspelled, but they Vermis Mysteries on it. At the very beginning, he said, "I did this because the Necronomicon is overdone." I didn't want a quote from that. So people have continued to write their own Necronomicons and seen it as a source of, whether it's spiritual power, whether it's a source of, it's an in-joke, whether it is, something to kind of, suggest to, people that there's a, a deeper reality to what's going on in the story. Oh, someone's, walking through someone's library in the story and they see the Necronomicon, and then you can take that in a few different directions. Sometimes it's even the paperback one, which is funny, but there's just all sorts of different aspects to it. I mean, it's turned up in movies after all sorts of movies, video games. It's just like this tremendous phenomenon, and I don't really think I'd want a catalog of all that, but it's interesting. I would like to see somebody take another stab at that at some point.
Well, I realized that I was like, I'm going to try and hang back and not say anything, but I have to admit that one of the things that this brings to mind for me is the last exorcism in the Penguin Book of Exorcisms. Was in Indiana, right?
Yeah, Gary, Indiana. They just made the movie version of it last year.
I want to say that when I picked up your Book of Exorcisms, I read the first few and then I jumped to the end, and I unwisely read that last account before bed, and it kept me up as a recovering Catholic. It kept me up into the night. I teach 7th and 8th grade. I oftentimes will bring what I'm reading into school just to have around. Kids pick it up, and I'm like, can't bring this in. If this is not too self-promotion-y, would you mind talking about that story? Assuming you remember that story, would you mind talking about it for a minute?
Yeah, so this was a Catholic exorcism that took place in Gary, Indiana, in I believe 2012. And what's significant about it is that basically all these details about this exorcism leaked. And so everybody found out about it. So normally when the Catholic Church does an exorcism, they are supposed to keep it under wraps. And in this case, what happened is this young woman with her 3 children and her mother, they all move into this house in this low-income neighborhood in Gary, Indiana, and they start experiencing, frankly, things derivative of the Amityville Horror. There are swarms of flies in winter. There are weird puddles that they don't know how they got there. And the children begin acting very strangely and having seizures. And one of them supposedly, was seen levitating and things like this. But the 2 sons, their issues are bad enough that they end up taking them to the hospital. They're fainting and not regaining consciousness. And then in the hospital, the grandmother is praying with one of the boys, and he walks his legs up on the wall behind him. So he's holding his grandmother's hands. He's got his legs braced against the wall, and he manages to walk all the way up the wall and onto the ceiling and basically flip over his grandmother. Now, that's not impossible. I couldn't do that, but possibly a lightweight boy with a lot of training could physically do that. But the woman from Child Protective Services sees this and she flips out. She says, "I saw that kid walk up a wall. These kids are possessed." And she writes that up in a report, right? That I saw this and I was terrified. And so they get the hospital chaplain. The hospital chaplain says, "I don't do this sort of thing. We need a Catholic." And so they call up Father Michael Magano, who I think was probably interested in exorcism prior to this. So you can't just do an exorcism as a Catholic priest. You've got to have permission from your bishop. And so he goes out to the house and investigates. And by this point, the local police think this house is haunted too. The police are also saying, "Yeah, the radio in my squad car was malfunctioning when I drove by the house. This is definitely, paranormal." So we have those reports as well from police saying this is something paranormal. So he writes this letter to the bishop, and that document leaked. And as someone who's interested in church history, this is really significant because there must have been a letter like that for practically every Catholic exorcism that's ever been done, but we don't get to see it normally. It's normally a secret church document. But this one leaked, and this is a priest who is sort of trying his best to make sense of what is happening to this family. And they go and they dig up, this house has a basement. They dig up the basement, which has a dirt floor, and they find stuff. And I think in most inhabited areas, if you dig in the ground, you're going to find stuff from humans who were there before you. They find a weight that they think might have been a curtain rod. They find candy wrappers. They find a pair of underwear. And Father Magano begins speculating that could there have been some kind of necromantic ritual done in this basement? Like, what if somebody's child got strangled accidentally with the curtain, with the curtain strings, which does happen sometimes, and they were doing this ritual down here to bring back their baby, and they were getting hungry from doing all this ritual magic, so they were eating candy bars. You know, and I say in the premise to this, I said, let's not be too hard on Father Magano. He's not a CSI operative or something. He's not trained in archaeology. He's doing the best that he can. The family is obviously really scared. And so the bishop approves this and says, it sounds like there is potential to help this family that outweighs the risk of embarrassment. He does exorcisms actually on the mother, not on the children. And after about 3 rounds of Catholic exorcism, that is declared to be effective. And the family moves away and the problems stop. And this leaked on the internet. I still had to get permission from Father Magano to publish it. And I just called him on the phone, on his church, church website, looked him up, and he was very gracious and said, this is already online, and yeah, you have permission to use it. So I'm grateful to him for that. But it was an interesting case, and almost immediately people started scrambling for the movie rights. And then Zach Baggins from the show Ghost Adventures purchased the house and demolished it so that no one else could do anything with it. But he kept the staircase from the house that had gone down to the basement, and he took that to his haunted museum in Las Vegas. So if you want to see a chunk of stairs from Gary, Indiana, where this event occurred, you can go out to Las Vegas and pay, I think, $50 to do the tour of Zach Baggins' collection.
Dan, you want to say anything?
Oh, so I'm gonna I may ask you a question that's out of left field. So when you were looking through all this material, how did Amityville play much of a role in terms of this like anti-D&D sort of crusader stuff? I mean, it just seems like, because generally Amityville these days is people just generally think it was a hoax, I think. Well, of course, I'm saying what people think, but people who've looked into it generally think it's a hoax. And now it's turning up in, elements of that is now turning up in an exorcism. So it seems like maybe there's been some, cross-pollination there, with all due respect to the father.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Amityville was absolutely a hoax. That's a proven fact. We have this lawyer who represented Ronnie DeFeo, who murdered 6 people in that house. And he said, yeah, I struck a deal with the current occupants who could afford the house but couldn't pay the property taxes. And I said, I will feed you information from this murder that no one else knows about. And DeFeo, his defense was, well, something demonic possessed me. Right? So I'm working on this insanity defense anyways. And then you guys the Lutz family, you can say that there's spooky stuff happening in the house, and we'll get a book and we'll make millions. And so they start they strike up this deal, and then the Lutzes say, we've already got all the secret insider information about these murders. We don't really need this lawyer anymore. Let's cut him out of the deal. And so the lawyer says, now, wait a second. If I can't get rich off of this, then nobody can. And so he goes to the press and says, this was all a hoax. I had this deal with the Lutzes, and they betrayed me. But by that point, nobody cares. The story is out there. There's all these lawsuits and countersuits about this. But very few people are even aware of that. So yeah, it was proven to be a hoax. I don't think that it would have happened had America not been reeling from the movie The Exorcist that came out at the end of 1973. And I think that if it had not been for that movie, if your house was infested with flies, you would have thought man, my house is infested with flies. This sucks. You would not think I'm being attacked by demons, right? So I have a book called The Exorcist Effect, where I talk about this, how movies purport to be based on true events, and then people watch those movies, and that kind of influences the way that they interpret the world around them, especially things like possible supernatural events. And then if their experiences get really big, like they did in Gary, Indiana, then that becomes the basis of another horror movie based on a true story. And the cycle starts all over again. So we can see a straight line from The Exorcist to the Amityville Horror, which of course Ed and Lorraine Warren hitched their wagon to now this new horror movie. I think it's just called The Deliverance, about this family in Gary, Indiana.
And it's interesting because The Exorcist also kind of cycled through the Simon Necronomicon, because that's kind of bringing in one of the spirits in there is Pazuzu, who is an Assyrian demon of the first millennium, and that's the villain of The Exorcist. Captain Howdy. But they show the statue in the Exorcist movie, that's a Pazuzu statue. And so I think that was part of the inspiration that kind of went into all of this. It was very much sort of steeped in this atmosphere where there was I think it was part of a spiritual community where people were very serious about what they did, but it was also looking at fiction and looking at movies and seeing all these things that kind of come together to create this book, which in the end sort of continued sort of the hysteria in a sense, whether that's what the authors intended or not. It became a very interesting prop for the Warrens and a lot of other people.
Yeah, and I saw William Peter Blatty at South by Southwest, and somebody asked him, why is the demon Pazuzu? And he was Lebanese American, and he had worked in the Foreign Service. And he said, because when I was deployed in the Foreign Service, I saw a statue of that, and it scared the hell out of me. That's why I picked it, right? But it's interesting, if you look at Pazuzu statues, if you hadn't heard of The Exorcist, there's no reason to think it's especially scary. So I do wonder, did he have that particular interpretation of these ancient Near Eastern artifacts because of things like H.P. Lovecraft and Orientalism and the idea of sort of hideous secrets buried in the deserts, right? So there's a possible feedback loop there between sort of weird tales and The Exorcist, and then the Simon Necronomicon getting published right when it did.
Yeah, I don't think the Pazuzu himself shows up in Lovecraft, but Lovecraft is very much about the going out and finding these buried things, which is actually, oddly enough, we'll bring it back to Dungeons and Dragons, because I think that a lot of that Lovecraft and other pulp authors sort of they kind of created this idea, a lot of the ideas that role-playing games still play with today, of going out and going into underground places and having these horrific life-changing experiences, though these days they're less horrific, I think, depending on what game you're playing.
Yeah, you remember the first edition Legends, and was it Deities and Demigods that had,
I will hold on.
Here it comes. Yeah.
Here it comes. Yeah. It's in terrible shape, but yeah.
And was it Lovecraft's estate that said they couldn't have the stats for Cthulhu and the other Lovecraftian beings in there?
What I understand it to be, and there have been different versions of this story, and I was also told to be very careful in the introduction of my new edition of the Encyclopedia that I didn't, because they didn't want to offend James Ward, but Jim Ward has passed since, so I'll just say this and I don't have to worry about what he might think. Basically what happens, I think that people, both it was also the Moorcock estate, doing with Elric and Stormbringer and all that sort of thing. And I think these estates just didn't know quite what they were licensing, because what is a role-playing game anyway? I mean, really, how do you explain that to somebody in 1980? And so what happened is, I think that they, both Chaosium, which was putting out Call of Cthulhu and Stormbringer, and TSR, both approached the estates for permission to use their creations. And then, so they both started publishing, and then they looked at each other's publications like, wait a minute, hold on. So I think what happened first was that they basically came to just kind of this amicable agreement to keep publishing. And then TSR later, because I think I have the edition of the book which actually thanks Chaosium for their permission. And then in a later edition, they just decided, no, we don't want to, why are we promoting Chaosium and these, these other games? We should probably just take these out. And I think that was more of an internal decision. There will be people who differ, of course.
Yeah, and having I've gotten it from both ends on this one. When you really have people start telling the story, it gets very bitter, very acrimonious. So it's difficult to say anything without footnotes, because people will get us in the comments. Like to give you, gosh,
Ben is not responsible for what I just said.
You did a very good and responsible job. I'll admit, off the top of my head, I can't recall the details, but I do recall airing an interview with I think it was a TSR person who became a Chaosium person, and then other TSR people contacted me complaining, and I actually had to go re-edit my episode to take out things that were said, because everyone is still so up in arms about this 30 years later. So it's amazing that this is more controversial than the Exorcisms and the Necronomicon. Like that, I'm like, it'll be fine. But we can't say anything about the licensing of Cthulhu in 1980 to TSR. It's just too much. So
and one of the things to look forward to for those of you who are, I'm hoping the next edition of the Encyclopedia will come out, is one of the things I asked Chaosium for was their original agreement with Arkham House to get a sense of like, while they, what exactly was licensed. And I think that, it was interesting because I was kind of going over that versus, because it referred to the Arkham House catalog. And so I went and looked at the Arkham House catalog, and I'm like, okay, well, this is an unusual selection of stuff. But I think that the whole idea was just like, we'll just license, out the whole thing, whatever that is, for the Cthulhu mythos. And I'm saying this because I know that the new management of Chaosium went back and said, we better go talk to these authors directly instead of just relying on a document from, a now, I think, defunct publisher. And we should probably make sure that, we're good with everything. So they went back and and reacquired permission from a lot of different people to continue making the game. So that kudos to them for that.
Joe, do you have any more questions for Dan or anything? And if not, that's fine.
Have you ever used those stats in a game? Like, have you ever had a party tried to fight Cthulhu? Like, why are the stats there? Is it just so they know mathematically how hopeless this is?
It's funny you asked this question, because I would not have them fight Cthulhu, because I am a purist. And what I'll have them do is I will get the original, what was it? I was running a basic game. So this is like the BX system that was, not the advanced game, but I ran that for several years. And I think the climax was in a spaceship engine room fighting Sathagua or Sadagua. And it was out of which it's like Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, I think. I took the stats out of that. I did take out the drains 4 levels because, per hit, because I wasn't too fond of that. It was disappointing. They just romped all over Sadagua and a bunch of giants and just completely blew out the final encounter. And I didn't. And the sad thing is that this is my attitude towards games is I create things and then you live in the world. So sometimes you just get an encounter that you completely blow everything out, and I'm not going to go back in and put in I got to give it 200 more hit points or something. But yeah, so I think it is those are kind of crazy, and it's interesting because that's I think they put those stats on there because they were just well, we'll make them really high so no one will, ever be able to defeat them. And then people went in and decided to, Hey, we got to fight these guys. They've got some pretty good swords and things like that. We can keep those for later.
Well, and with early D&D and perhaps even with modern D&D, the assumption is almost always, well, you're gonna kill this thing, right? You know, if this isn't too much of a step sideways, I would mention that, you know, in early editions of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, they had monster stats for like gods. So I just grabbed my 7th edition of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, very well regarded, 21st century design, and I flipped to the deity section, and they still have stats for Cthulhu. And
no, I think first edition didn't have stats for them.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So it would suggest in the first edition they were like, oh, you'll never fight him, but then at some point they were like, well, someone's going to fight him. We better put those stats in there, which is, you know, again, I don't feel that that's the presumption of Call of Cthulhu at all, because so often in Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, if you're fighting, you failed. This is you made the wrong choice, you know. So it's really interesting to me. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to step sideways.
Call of Cthulhu is one of those weird games where apparently having an unimpressive ending is what you're going for sometimes, because if you go through the summoning and you have to fight the big you know, great old one from outer space, then you've lost already. So it's better just to, I don't know, you know, blow up the cultist headquarters or something and then just go home. Which is, it's a weird dynamic for you know, a game that's, you know, supposed to be exciting and interesting. And oh my gosh, am I going to get in trouble with Chaosium for saying that? I don't know, but it's interesting. It's just, you know, it's a different way of looking at things. It's more like problem solving than, you know, going for the high drama in a lot of cases.
Can I rescue you by quoting Ken Hite and then I'll be quiet again?
Go ahead.
So Ken Hite, game designer Ken Hite, would often say that Call of Cthulhu is the greatest role-playing game, because while D&D is just a power fantasy, you know, we wish that as we got older, we got better at everything all the time, and you know what, we had more hit points as we age. That is not the way it goes. Call of Cthulhu is a reflection of the true state of things, which is the more you go about in life, the weaker you get, the crazier you get, and it almost always ends with your death. And Call of Cthulhu is a sort of practice for that. And I think it's Joe. I think I'm quoting Joe here when I say that a role-playing game allows us to create a space outside from which to view the world. In which case, you know, Call of Cthulhu is allowing us to examine our own mortality.
And I want to bring this back around to Joe, because I just, you know, sped read the audiobook, however you can do that.
Sped listened.
And yeah, well, and one of the things that was, I lived through the Satanic Panic. I'll just tell you guys this story real quick. I at one point threw all my Dungeons and Dragons stuff in the kitchen garbage because Paul Harvey came on the radio and he said that, you know, Dungeons and Dragons was bad and evil. It was getting people killed. I don't know. I took it out afterward. So I don't know whether that was me or my parents saying, don't throw out all your stuff. That sounds like the sort of thing my parents would say. But yeah, so one of the interesting things from living through that period and also from reading your book that it brought back to my, as a highlight, Call of Cthulhu was, you know, was selling throughout this period, and it got very little attention. And as just, and you look at it, you look at not you know, the philosophical side of it, and the magical side of it, and the pantheon sort of side of it, and the actual more, it's actually more linked to modern occultism than Dungeons and Dragons ever would. But it just was, in terms of people, you know, who were trying to start a moral panic, it would get mentioned. But for the most part, you know, people just ignored it. It's just like, okay, Dungeons and Dragons, that's the big seller. Let's you know, let's concentrate on that. Or they didn't even know about Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think it's partly that, you know, small children were not playing Call of Cthulhu the way that they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. So it was hard to make the kind of won't someone think of the children move. But I also think that they kind of didn't need that, because the people that they were trying to persuade, they could just say things like, did you know that the word hell appears 300 times in the Dungeon Master's Guide? And that makes more sense than if they're saying, like, did you know that the Enochian keys are listed as an appendix? And this, they're going to say, what is that? I don't know what that is.
I guess I could see that, because you're at least in Dungeons and Dragons, you're sort of dealing with a book that was created by Christian authors that does draw upon that sort of imagery, both on the positive side, like such as in the cleric spells or creation of holy water, and also on the sort of demonic side of things. So you have stats for the demons and things like that, as opposed to Call of Cthulhu, where you have to start explaining cosmic indifferentism and all sorts of other stuff, which
Some of the claims makers, though, were into Lovecraft, particularly John Todd. John Todd, if you've ever seen the Chick tract Dark Dungeon about Dungeons and Dragons, there's a preacher there at the end with a handlebar mustache who tells people to burn all their D&D books. And actually, in the original comic, he says, including J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. and they took that out. But that's supposed to be John Todd. John Todd got really into the movie The Dunwich Horror that came out in 1970 and started telling people that the Necronomicon is real. And in fact, that the Book of Mormon was adapted from the Necronomicon. he didn't like Mormons either. And then you have this guy, Eric Schnobelin. William Schnobelin, who he will just say anything. He has said that he was a literal vampire at one point who fed exclusively on human blood until it couldn't go in the sunlight, until he made his monthly dues payment to the Church of Satan, and the cashier blessed him, and that stopped all his vampire powers. But he is deep into Cthulhu as well, and he has talked about how he's summon Lovecraftian monsters through the Necronomicon and all this kind of stuff. If you actually read some of his books, and I think the people actually reading your book don't know what any of this stuff is and don't care about it. The only people who know what this stuff is are people who think you're full of crap. But it is interesting how kind of the Lovecraftian mythos was admired by some people, fueling this moral panic.
He will say anything is one of the most hilarious and chilling things I've ever heard anyone say.
Well, Schnobelin also said that Gary Gygax came to him when he was a Satanist before he had found Jesus and said, I just want to make sure that all the spells in D&D are totally accurate so that they will actually damn the souls of young children. And then he gave Gary Gygax his blessing, and then that's how D&D got made, according to William Schnobelin.
I should probably say at this point, which we already knew, your listeners already knew, but having studied magic for probably since grad school, there's nothing in Dungeons and Dragons that's really all that useful. Maybe there's like a list of special properties of gemstones in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. Maybe some of the like the little somatic the material components are occasionally, I could see those, but nobody could do magic out of these books at all. It looks very, very sort of different. I mean, I was thinking about Cacodemon, of course, the 7th level spell. It's very much sort of a folklore way of summoning demons. It's very much like, okay, well, you got to get the human blood. Whereas most of the the old rituals were more like, no, don't give them any blood. Don't give them anything like that. And if they ask for it, you tell them no. Stop messing around. And you've got to bring me a huge pile of treasure right now. So, which would of course have messed up the whole XP for gold sort of arrangement in AD&D. So they wouldn't have put that in anyway.
Well, I regret to say that our time is winding down. So I'll start with Joe. We've mentioned many of your books at this point. I guess I'll ask, which one would put the most royalties in your pocket if people purchased it?
Well, in October, my book, The Penguin Book of Cults, came out. So that's available wherever bookstores are sold. And there's also an audiobook you can listen to. So please check that out. And if you like it, tell your friends.
Yeah, I would say every book that I've purchased with your name on it has fully absorbed me. Like I don't think you put out a bad book, which is remarkable. My favorite is still probably Dangerous Games. It was really reliable in my first book, and I shouldn't say reliable. It was really crucial to my first book, and I'm going to need to use it in my second book too. And yeah, it's just, you've got amazing stuff in there. Amazing stuff. You're really thinking deeply about things that a lot of people just glance off the surface on. So thank you for that. And I'll ask Dan. So Encyclopedia Cthuliana is coming. Is there going to be a Kickstarter? Is it just going to show up in Barnes & Noble one day?
I think it's just going to show up. I don't think it's planned for a Kickstarter or anything like that. I think hopefully it'll show up later this year. It's going to be, for those of you who have the older editions, it's going to be probably twice, like 150% of the original text. And it's going to be fully illustrated, which is something that I've really wanted. I do not know the price point, but it is going to come out, and I'm really excited about it, and it's going to look really, really nice.
Would you two indulge me for one more quick question?
Sure.
Could you recommend a book to the audience? I think I'm stealing this from Ezra Kleindl if he asks for 3, but again, you're both of you are such great writers. I'd love to know what you're reading or what you would recommend to an audience.
Boy, that would seem like a simple question.
I know.
I don't want to recommend some book of religious studies theory from the University of Chicago.
No, do that. That's what we're here for. Tell us all about the book of religious studies from the University of Chicago.
I got a book for the Christmas break, which I have not had time to read, but it is by Sax Rohmer. Sax Rohmer created the character Fu Manchu, which is this very kind of racist pulp character. But he actually wrote a book called The Paranormal, which was his actual beliefs about a magic and the paranormal. So not fiction, but his actual kind of findings. So I'm interested in kind of, poppy occultism, but from the 30s when Sax Rohmer was writing. So yeah, I think that's a good book to go and check out.
I'm going to try to get myself out of trouble with Chaosium by talking about Pendragon. But I'm back in trouble with Chaosium because this isn't the most recent version of Pendragon. Oh well, I didn't have that right here. Pendragon is a game I love. It is about everyone's a knight. You're just a knight. There's no thieves. There's no wizards. There's no clerics. You are a knight. And the question is what kind of knight you're going to be and what kind of personality you have and how you relate to other people and how often you get knocked off your horse. So it's also a generational game. It's really a lot of fun. You get to hang out with Arthur and Gawain and Lancelot and then get in trouble and then they knock you off your horses.
Remarkable. Well, Joe, Dan, I really appreciate you spending Friday night with me. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.